In this mini masterclass, I want to talk with you about how to prepare an interesting and engaging CLIL lesson. Now, you might be watching this live on Facebook, but you might also be watching this at a later time on YouTube or on other places on my website. So just feel free to let me know if you have any questions about this wherever you are currently. Now, what I want to do is I want to allow you to discover the 4 stages that can be applied to your CLIL lesson. I want you to understand how to use these stages to improve both the learning and the language in your lesson, and I want to learn you how to apply. I want to teach you so you can learn how to apply a CLIL activity to each of these stages. What I just mentioned, I want to inspire you and make sure that you really can use CLIL in your lesson. If you're new and just looking for ways to actually start, or if you're more experienced and you want to have a few more ideas, in both cases you will find things in this video that I'm sure you will like. So let's start. The 4 lesson stages are the opening, the informing stage, the applying stage, and the working stage. Now, I did not think of these stages myself. They're actually from research, and you might be able to actually see that you already do a lot of these things in your lesson as well. I'm not here to teach you things that are overly revolutionary or anything like that. I just want to show you that in a very basic lesson you can already use CLIL to really make sure that your students are working more with language and are more engaged with the language as well. So for each of these 4 stages I will share not only a nice idea but also how I do this in my lesson, so you know how to use it in a practical way. So let's start with the opening. Now, the opening can be a very complicated lesson stage because the students are entering your lesson and they're talking about a lot of different things, and you need to get them in a learning mood. You need to make sure that they're not fighting, but you also need to get ready with your lesson objectives, etc. So there's a lot of things going on right at the start. And I know that when I started teaching, one of the first tasks I received from my coach was, okay, go and observe like 20 different teachers, just the first 10 minutes of a lesson, and see what they do. And this was a great way to start learning how to become a teacher, because every teacher has a certain way of starting a new lesson, and some of them are really good at getting the students to be silent immediately, and other teachers just have a more natural way of getting the attention and don't need to enforce anything. And it's really interesting to see all of that. I don't know about you, but I really enjoy watching fellow teachers teach and providing them with feedback, but also learn from them and see what they can actually do, what they actually do in lesson that I can apply in my lessons as well. There's always new things to discover when observing fellow teachers. But let's go back to the topic. A CLIL activity for the opening of a lesson. No, that should have a different title. Anyways, the opening has 2 parts: setting the stage and activating prior knowledge. Now, during the setting up the stage part, you say what's the goal of the lesson, you tell them what they can expect from this lesson, so you show them a step by step. Okay, we're going to start with this, then we're going to do this, and I always provide them with the homework right at the start of the lesson, just to make sure we cover all the administrative work, and I don't need to do that at the end of the lesson, because I prefer to keep the end of the lesson for something else, but more on that later on. So the goals of the lesson will be something like, at the end of this lesson you know these things, and they might very well be language related because it's a CLIL lesson. So you know how to, in my case for example, you know what's a parameter or the formula for a parameter. I'm a math teacher, just in case you didn't know that. And it might also contain can statements, so you can calculate the area of a circle with a radius of 2 centimeters, something like that. So if you know and can statements as lesson objectives, students like, and I ask them this, and it's obviously also shown in research that if you have a clear goal, that it's easier to motivate yourself and it's easier to see that you have made some progress. So setting a few goals clearly at the beginning of the lesson really helps students to tune in and see what you're going to do. I also always share the things that we're going to do this lesson. So this will be an opening, there will be something that I have to say, there's something that I need to explain to them or other ways to inform them. There will be 1 or 2 extra activities to help them with applying the knowledge. And I ask my students, despite the fact that lots of times those schedules are quite the same, I ask them, do you like this, or is it a bit boring? And a lot of students replied that they really like the fact that they just know what to expect, even if it's almost the same every lesson. They just like seeing it, and it also maybe forces you a little bit to follow a certain structure. But if you know me a little, I change a lot of things while I teach. So I might just say, okay, this might be something that we do if we have time, and at the end of the lesson I will go back to this and say, okay, we didn't do this, so I'll just take that with me for the next lesson. But that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't have to be super static. You can make that, you can work with it in a flexible way, but it still doesn't mean that you don't have to say something about what you're going to do. And lastly, as I said, I tell them what the homework is, but obviously that's a personal note. You might just prefer to do that in a different way. After that, you activate prior knowledge, and that's where the CLIL activity that I want to share with you comes in. Activity I always use is called the problem of the day, and it's actually 3 problems. One is where it is language based, so it's something they needed to learn, so I just ask them to explain a phrase in their own language. The second is subject based, so it will be something like, okay, apply this. In my case, it's obviously often a calculation, but it might be something else for your subject. And the third is always something trickier. So it's still subject based, but it's in a new setting, and it's something meant to challenge the students. Now sometimes I also choose to have 2 language based and a more challenging one and 1 applying one. Just, it doesn't have to be 3 problems, but the idea is that there is a certain structure in the questions that I ask. And I ask these for a reason. Because I want to test if they actually know the language that we're going to use this lesson. I want to see if they know what to apply, that the knowledge that I'm going to use in this lesson that I'm going to build upon. I need to make sure that they are aware of that. And I know that when I was still a student, I really needed someone to tell me, okay, remember we did this last time. If a teacher would just start talking immediately, as if right where we left off the previous lesson, without any recap, I would not be able to keep up. And I don't know if that's the same for you, but I know it's quite the same for a lot of your students. Now I do this in silence. That doesn't mean you have to do that, but I like to do this in silence because that gives me some time to do some administrative work, and I also want to see if the students actually know it themselves and not if their neighbor knows it, because then I'm not activating their prior knowledge. I just like to have this moment of silence in my lesson right at the beginning of the lesson to make sure that the energy flows are somehow regulated and they're all tuned in into things that I want to do with them. If you want more practical ideas, you can find those in the 100% CLIL lesson blueprint, but I will talk about that a bit more at the end of this presentation. Now next up is the informing stage, and the purpose of this stage is to introduce something new to students. Now I'm calling this informing stage for a reason, because it's not the same as the instruction. Instruction applies to teachers sharing something with students and they have to learn from the teacher. But I'm calling this informing stage because there might be many more sources of information, sources of input that can help your students to actually improve. So this is something that I just wanted to share with you. Of course, maybe 9 out of 10 times this might be an instruction, but it doesn't have to be. And allow me to share an activity and that you can use that doesn't necessarily need you as a teacher to be the source of information. This can be a book, this can be an internet web page, this can be a video, whatever. Because students nowadays can find information in a lot of different places, and it might be something to have an idea to think about when you prepare your lesson. Am I the number 1 source of information? And you will be quite often, but sometimes they might be able to do some things on their own, and obviously giving them that source, that idea of self-awareness and self-control will make them better learners, and that's obviously the goal of CLIL in the end. So mind the gap. I just had to think about this when I prepared this presentation. This activity is called fill in the gaps, but I immediately had to think about the mind the gap thing that you hear quite often at train stations. So sorry about the picture, but just something that I had to think of. What I do is I share sentences for students to copy, and there are gaps, so some words are left out. And the students then have to listen to me or you or other sources of information like a book or a video, and they have to fill in the gaps. Now you might know this from listening tests where you get a beep and then you have to fill in 1 or 2 words that are missing, maybe even multiple choice, which I think is something you can also do in lesson. But using this in combination with you as a teacher, listening to you, or reading a book and finding this information, I think this is a great way to help them focus on what you want them to learn. Now, as I said, I really like the multiple choice effect here as well because, well, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I made the students do this. I asked them to copy a few sentences, and then I put in 2 or 3 options for each gap, and then they had to listen to me while I explained. And they did not have to worry about the language because we already had discussed that, which is the first reason I really like to use this activity. They have already had some time to read the sentences and think about the language and ask questions if they didn't understand. But I also make sure that they focus on the important things of my story. So I might just elaborate on a lot of things, but I know there's a few key elements that I really want to make sure my students know. So I make sure by giving them these sentences, they have exactly the things in their notebooks that I want them to have in there. Another reason I really like this activity is that students who read this and think, oh, I already know this, and they can move on, and this allows for a differentiation in your lesson. So you might tell them, okay, read this through. If you feel you understand, then you can already start, with the homework or with the next task, and you don't have to listen to me. Then you don't get those students that might really understand and just don't sit back and enjoy the show and don't really do anything because they're not challenged anymore. By implementing a differentiation activity like this, you really make sure students are engaged as well. And this is actually part of a setup that I use to teach students how to take notes, because I feel students do not get taught that skill often enough. So I teach them the skill of taking notes, and this activity is actually part of a setup for that. But again, more about that in the CLIL lesson blueprint, which I will talk about a bit more later on. Then we get to the third stage, which is the applying stage. Now, the applying stage is all about getting the students to work, to do something. And this can be both individually, in pairs, or in groups. Now, I know that there's quite a few people who say, well, when you teach a CLIL lesson, you have to motivate output. So in other words, they should be speaking. And I completely agree with that, but I don't think I need them to speak 100% of the time. As I mentioned already during the problem of the day activity, ask students to work in silence. And during this applying activity, there might be moments that you also want them to work in silence as well. Active learning does not mean running around. Active learning means they're actively learning, and it happens up here. So I have a lot of moments in my lesson where I ask students to work on their own. And yes, they will work together in pairs, and they might even make groups later on in the school year where they have to work together using, again, scaffolding to structure their learning and make sure there's activities that motivate group work. But it does not mean that working individually is not CLIL. It just means that it is an important element of your lesson, whether it's CLIL or not. Making it CLIL means, okay, what do you do with it afterwards? And that's where the next activity comes in, which I think a golden oldie almost, because a lot of people already know this one. But I just wanted to share with you that this works in a CLIL lesson in a very good way, because students have to come up with their own idea, the thinking part. They shared it with the partner and then determine the best answer, which is the pairing part, and obviously then they share it with the group, which is the sharing part. Now, you notice there's actually 2 out of 3 here have to do with discussing things. So they are talking with each other. They might have get stuck at certain elements of the problem, and they have to talk about how to solve it. Or you ask them to check each other's answers by swapping their papers and a piece of paper. And that's something that they tend to be a lot more critical on their friends' work than I am as a teacher. So this is something that you can really try to do. And then I would ask 2 or 3 students randomly to share their idea in class. So there's a lot of talking going on. There's a lot of motivating language output. But there's also an element here where students have to think individually on their own. Then the last stage, the reflecting stage. Now, this stage is often forgotten. I know it happens to me sometimes, but not as often anymore as I did in the past, where I would just hear the bell and it was like, oh, that's the end of the lesson. Don't forget to, write a homework or whatever. And the students are already packing their bags, and, I prefer my lessons to end when I want them to and not when the bell rings and tells me that the lesson is over. So, make sure that you plan some time for the reflecting part of your lesson. The end of the lesson is really important. It just takes a few minutes, but it helps you to really go back to the beginning of the lesson, see if things worked out, etc. So let's have a quick look on how you can make this work. It is a great moment to reflect upon subject-specific goals. Remember when I said at the beginning of the lesson, you say, okay, these are the things you can do at the end of the lesson. Now is the time to go back to those lesson objectives, those lesson goals, and ask the students, okay, so can you now explain this word to me? Do you know how to describe this element? Can you now solve this equation, whatever? But that's the moment where you look back on your lesson goals and make sure that they actually learned something. But it's also a very good moment to do language specific challenges where you ask the students, okay, so now we have done we discussed a few new phrases, now write down at least 2 new words that you learned this lesson. Or is there any words that you still don't understand from this list of words we discussed? You know, something language specific. It really helps you to make sure that you discussed everything, both content and language wise. And it's also a moment where you can talk about how they behaved in the group, what their role was in a certain situation, how they feel that they work together and they were speaking English, for example. So this is also a moment where you can give them some behavioral feedback, and they also can provide this to each other or to themselves. Now, an activity I use almost every lesson is the activity on a scale of. It's quite simple. Students rate their own level of understanding on a scale of 1 to whatever you want. I ask students on a scale of 1 to 10, but if you find that's different in your country, or you just prefer a smaller scale, you can choose that yourself. I really like to do this because I then ask them, okay, if you feel you understand the topic of this lesson, rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, and then raise your hand if it's a 6 or higher. This is a very easy thing to do. It just takes 1 minute, but it gives you a lot of valuable information because it tells me if only half the class shows that they feel they understand, I have something to do the next lesson. And it's really important information. If all of the students raise their hands, I know, okay, I am now quite sure that I ticked off all the boxes, and I know that they feel they understand. At least they have the idea. And of course, when they start working on it and they work on it at home, maybe they will find if they actually understand it. But at least they feel they understand it, and that's a great start, because I don't want to be a teacher where the students go back home and say, well, I didn't understand anything he said, and it also, if it's just 2 or 3 people who do not raise their hands, you also know, okay, I have to keep those kids in mind. And if it happens a couple of lessons in a row, I might just have to do something about that and help them out. So, concluding, what did we discuss? We talked about the 4 lesson stages: the opening, the informing stage, the applying stage, and the reflecting stage. I gave you a CLIL activity for each of these activities to apply, and I talked about how language is a key in all of these activities, because they all involve a certain way of language, mostly output, and that makes it a CLIL activity. Now, all of these activities can be applied to your lesson now, but there are so many more possibilities to try. Alright, now let's talk about the 100% CLIL lesson blueprint, which is something I created to help you find all that bit of information, get all the ideas running, and make sure that your lesson is 100% CLIL. Now, in this CLIL lesson blueprint, you're going to find even more practical lesson ideas and activities, and it even includes a behind-the-scenes recording of me while I prepare a CLIL lesson, and I guide you through all the steps that I take that we just discussed in this video to show you how I prepare a CLIL lesson in 15 minutes. I even included a list of over 30 CLIL activities that you can use in your lesson right now. Now, the price of this training is €19.95, and that's like a few good beers. I don't know about you, but I like special beers, good beers, and a few of those on an evening is already this price. And believe me, if you talk about long-term investments, I'm guessing that a training like this will certainly have a more lasting effect than a few good beers on one evening. And with this training, you will be able to really improve the way you teach your CLIL lessons. You will have ideas that you can apply. You don't have to think about what to do anymore. and you can actually see me prepare things so you know that it works for you as well. I'm not someone special, I'm just a math teacher who teaches CLIL, and if I can do it, you can do it, and allow me to show you how it works step by step with all of these ideas. So find out more information on the page below and join the CLIL lesson blueprint and allow me to help you improve your lessons and make them even better. Good luck.